Okay, welcome to the 23rd episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today, I am delighted to be welcoming back Rod Boothroyd to the podcast. Rod is a counselor, psychotherapist, a certified Healing the Shadow practitioner, and the author of the book Warrior, Magician, Lover, King, a guide to the male archetypes updated for the 21st century. He works with men, women, and mixed groups to heal the wounds of childhood with Marianne Hill. And he also teaches, who trains people in the art of working with the shadow and healing emotional wounds. Welcome, Rod.
Thank you very much, Piers. It's great to see you again.
Well, thank you for coming back. We did my first podcast, I think it was April or May, at the beginning of lockdown, 2020.
Wow, it's quite a while back.
Yeah. And I've had quite a few requests from clients, from people who've seen the film, the first episode, like, oh, I'd love you to get Rod back on. So
here we are.
Here we are again. So today, our topic is really going into more depth into the archetypes, and especially with the warrior. So what I'd love for you to begin today is just to explain a little bit, what is the warrior archetype, please, Rod?
Yes, sure. So I want to start by taking you on a journey to a jungle somewhere in Africa, and a naive young research student named Jane Goodall, who went out there with an anthropomorphic desire to spend her time with chimpanzees, studying their behavior as a doctoral research project. But by her own admission, she went with this slightly romanticized, completely romanticized vision of them as loving creatures who cared for each other in tribes which were closely bonded, were gentle creatures that lived off the harvests of the forests, and generally, I think, in her mind, served as a counterpoint to human existence and warfare. Sad to say, as Jane later admitted and has recently recapitulated on her earlier viewpoint, the chimps were anything but gentle and docile creatures. They were savage, warlike creatures who wouldn't hesitate to kill members of other tribes if they met them on the boundary of their territory. They wouldn't hesitate to kill monkeys if they found them for food, rip them apart. And they wouldn't hesitate to have squabbles, quite savage ones, amongst themselves to establish dominance hierarchies, both the males and the females. And as Jane put it quite recently, I was so naive, they could have chewed my face off, is the way she put it, if they wanted to. So why do I mention all of that? Because chimps are 98.8% genetically identical to human beings. So we are only 1.2% difference in terms of genetic material. And what that says to me is it serves us well to look at their behavior, to just get a different viewpoint on our behavior. That sense of, we could call it warlike behavior, but let's break that down into what it actually looks like for the chimp tribe and for us, really. This is the genetic basis of the warrior archetype that's programmed into us. Number one, defending boundaries. So this is the boundary of the chimp's territory, or in our terms, the piece of land we live on, and more subtly, the psychological and emotional boundaries that we hold. The necessity to get out and do what's necessary to survive. In the chimp's case, of course, that would be scouting for food, looking for threats, defending against invaders, looking after the tribe, the newborns, the females. And of course, in the case of the dominant males and females in the group, providing leadership and protection. And when you think about what the warrior archetype does in our human condition, it's extremely similar. Defending boundaries, going out and doing what's needed to survive, and providing leadership and protection. So the thesis I have here is that it's inbuilt into us. This isn't some construct. It's genetically programmed into us. What makes us different, of course, is that 1.2% of genes which give us choice, hopefully give us choice. And if you look at the history of the human race, you might think there's only been, there's only been about 300 years in the last 3,500 years where there hasn't been a war taking place somewhere on the surface of this planet. So you might think that 1.2% of genetic materials not helping us control our warriors very well. And frankly, I'd agree with that position, that point of view.
Thank you. Interesting. Yeah, I was reading your book last night. I haven't put it up. If you've not bought his book, this is a fascinating update, because since we last spoke, I've really gone in deeply into Robert Moore's and Douglas Gillette's book, and I find yours is much easier to read. I was just reading through The Warrior last night. I can't remember what kind of came up to me, but I think you're explaining a story at the beginning similarly, and it's like, yeah. I really kind of resonate with what you're saying there about the chimpanzees.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the point, Piers. You know, the fact that it's genetically programmed into us, it's not some kind of construct, means that we have a real responsibility with that human extra addition to the chimp's way of life, a real responsibility to control how we express the warrior. And that is, I think, the weakest aspect of the human condition currently. Well, that's arguable. But the inability to control that warrior energy is clearly, look around the world, it's having a destructive effect all around the world. So maybe we need to exercise choice about how we express that warrior archetype more. And maybe in doing that, we can adapt it to something that's more suitable for our modern world and our particular individual way of life. So to answer the question, what's the warrior archetype do, or what's it for in humans? Well, it might be about taking action in the world, going out, getting things done. You know, frankly, at its basis, it's about what gets you out of bed in the morning and on the road and doing stuff. Setting boundaries, of course, we've already mentioned that. And war is a manifestation of that, of course. It's all about boundaries, ultimately, or aspirations to invade other people's territory. Setting boundaries on a local level might mean saying, that's not acceptable, that's not okay with me, to your partner when she or he does something that's unacceptable or invades your territory, psychological territory. It might mean setting boundaries with your children. That's not acceptable, don't do that. Don't kick your brother when he steals your toy, that kind of thing. At an earlier age, it's about individuation. Sweet children, as all parents will know, start saying no when they're 18 months, 2 years old.
Terrible twos.
Terrible twos. Which is not so much about, no, I don't want the broccoli. It's more about, no, I want to find out what happens when I say no to a big person, and what influence and power do I have in the world to kind of set my boundary. Like, if I can say no and not eat something, then I'm exerting myself in a very obvious way against somebody else who wants something different. And in that process, and many others like it, the child can get a sense of, this is where I stop, this is where somebody else begins, and this is where we meet. And the no, not doing it, no. And then the parent pushes back and the child reinforces the no. And so comes to understand his or her own identity more clearly. And also in that too, the fact that they can impact the world. You know, I think many parents will recognize that child's energy around, yes, I want this toy at Christmas, is somehow in the end going to wear them down, and the child gets the toy because yes, I want, this is what I want. It's a good warrior exercise for a child to learn that they can influence what's going on in their world and get what they want. Might not be so good for the parent, of course, but still. So in that, there's a sense of existence, a sense of I am a separate person to everybody else, which of course gives the child their identity, the sense of being and separate being. And in that also, actually, I believe the right to exist, sense of the right to exist. And the way I put it is not just a sense of the right to exist, but the sense of the right to exist in the space I'm occupying. You know, Here I am. This is my space. It's mine. Nobody else can come into it. I occupy it. I have a right to occupy it. And on that note, just as a side comment for a moment, I used to think that most suicide was because of deep wounds in the lover archetype, abandonment, not being wanted, all of that kind of need for connection. But I've come to see more recently that quite a lot of suicide, some suicide at least, is about a sense of having no right to exist in the psyche. That somehow in childhood, the emotional wounds were such that somebody felt or learnt or came to believe about themselves, I just don't actually have a right to be here. And that, of course, in its extreme form, can play out as suicide, I believe.
Yeah, I can really resonate with that. I tried to take my own life in my 20s, and I remember realizing that I wanted people to notice me. So I wanted people to know that I exist.
Yeah.
How
extraordinary. I'm glad you didn't succeed, by the way. But what it does make the point, doesn't it, that was actually your feeling at the time.
Yeah. And what kind of underneath that was, I wanted others to listen. I wanted to hear me. And I realized underneath that was actually what I wanted was me to hear myself.
Of course.
Yeah. I wanted to know that I existed to me, and that was really powerful. That, oh, okay, yeah. I can exist and I can be me.
Crikey.
Thank you.
There's one other thing I'd like to add. I think this is true of all archetypes, but there's something also, it's not necessarily a function of the archetype, but it's certainly a product of living in any archetype fully, how alive you feel. I mean, if you think of making love in the lover archetype, standing on stage and setting out your vision to a massive audience, if that's what turns you on, in the king archetype, solving a complex problem in the magician archetype, and in the warrior archetype, just having an experience which is like, wow, look what the fuck I've done.
Yeah.
It makes you feel alive. It gives you a sense of, here I am, wow. I remember two of the most finestly defined moments like that in my life. One where I was doing some parachute jumping 40 years ago. And I keep, interestingly enough, having a sense of wanting to do it again. I think I need to curb that warrior impulse in me. Makes me question, what is it that's not being expressed in my warrior that needs to be? But that moment of jumping out of the plane, oh my God, talk about feeling alive in every cell of your body. And also when I was doing some mountaineering in the Lake District, celebrating my 50th birthday, going up Jack's Rake, which is an ascent on the side of a cliff at more or less 45 degrees for, I think, about 250 meters from bottom to top. That's in elevation, not in distance. And there's a point where you have to climb around a buttress, and the advice of the guides is don't look down, because at that point there's nothing beneath you. And I was on 3 points of contact. That's the advice that you're always given. Don't make a move till you've got 3 points of contact and then move it forth. And I was there, and there was somebody up ahead of me having a bit of a moment on this, and I could suddenly started to feel my hands and feet slipping down the rock. And the thought that passed through my mind was, if I die now, I'll die happy. It's like the warrior in his finest moment of, what an achievement, what a beautiful, glorious moment. If I die now, I'll die happy. Happily, I did not, as you can observe. But that was such a lesson to me about the energy that these archetypes can bring so unexpectedly, and to feel so alive on the verge of death is a real, I think, warrior, I was going to say quality, but let's say characteristic. It reminded me of the Native Americans reputedly going into battle with a war cry which went, today is a good day to die. So, and we talk there about one of the qualities of the warrior, which is something like acceptance of loss, acceptance of death, acceptance of what is in the service of something greater.
Interesting. Yeah, I was reading your stories last night, and some bits about the parachute, that when you came and landed on the ground, the other instructors came running up to you and like, right. Now you know what it feels like. Wow, we're
that's
really
the one.
this.
Exactly. Now you know why we do it. Yes. Yes, I do know why we do it.
Yeah.
To feel alive, so alive in a way that isn't part of everyday life. Which, let's face it, can be full of waiting and watching and unhappiness and mundane things, like most of us have spent the last 2 years in some kind of, I would judge, slightly or majorly depressed warrior energy. And then, I say, well, okay, that's part of the warrior's way of being in the world, acceptance of what is, until he's called upon to go out, take action, get something done, service in service to the king's mission, hopefully, etc., etc.
I'd love to speak a little bit about that with the warrior archetype, about his relationship to the king, what you mean by that, and being in service to the king.
Well, I think that the answer to that is best summarized by this sense of seeing the mind as divided into different archetypes, so that we've got the warrior, the action, the king, the leader, the lover, speaks for itself. It's about connection rather than sex, but sex is a part of that, obviously. And the magician, which is about thinking. And we've got those archetypes consisting of memories and behavior patterns and neural pathways laid down in the brain somehow. And also not just at the age we're at now, but those memories constituting historical record, like the child at 2 or 3 demanding a toy. That's something we could access probably in most people by going into a kind of regression and just bringing out their childhood experiences, which of course is the basis of healing emotional wounds in childhood, rewriting those neural pathways to have a more beneficial, harmonious impact on the person than perhaps the pain that they were left with from what actually happened in their lives. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think maybe it's to do with sometimes what I see with the warrior is that some people get on and they do something, but they don't have the leader. They've not really connected to the king's vision or his leadership to go, whoa, wait a minute, where are you going?
Exactly. And I said a moment ago, didn't I, that I thought the warrior was perhaps the most damaging archetype in the world today. But you know what, on reflection, I think what's most damaging is the absence of king. Because when you think about king, and I'm not talking just about male kings, I'm talking about queens, let's call them sovereigns or leaders. They're about setting objectives that serve the community, the tribe, the kingship, the queendom, whatever it is. They're about leading people to a better life, at least in their fine form they are. That archetype is about leading people to a better place, spiritually, emotionally, physically, providing people with a sense of purpose and mission, having a mission themselves. And yet, when you look around the world at the quality of leadership we've actually got, I wouldn't say it's high or even good. In fact, in some cases, it's downright appalling. And then, so that raises the question, well, if we don't have leaders at a political and country level that are worth anything very much, is it a surprise that as individuals in society, we don't have internal kings and queens that are good leaders? And the answer is no. It's not surprising in the slightest. And where do people go if they don't have an internal leader that can set a purpose for their life, a vision for their life, a mission? The answer is they just act pretty randomly and responds to what's going on in the world. So when there isn't a king or queen present, warriors won't be directed, like think of the soldier and the general in the army. There's got to be a line of command. And so what can happen then is that the warrior goes off on his or her own mad campaigns, unregulated, killing sprees. We saw this, of course, in many wars, but the one that I studied particularly was the Vietnam War, where troops would go off on killing sprees because they were not getting leadership of the quality that would have reined their warriors in. And it's just the same for us. Perhaps we're not going to go out on a killing spree, but we're going to go out on some mad campaign to get things done that doesn't necessarily serve a really useful, productive, or aligned mission or purpose. Same with a magician, incidentally. They can go off on mad. They're not getting instruction from the sovereign. They can go off on mad missions of their own, holed up in their laboratories somewhere in here, formulating madcap schemes. So king's essential, and we will talk more about that when we come to the sovereign. But in the meantime, yes, the warrior needs to be directed. And a great practice is to just check in with yourself every morning and say something like, what do I need to do today? What do I really need to do today? Yeah. And then, okay, warrior, how am I going to get that done? Almost like you're talking to a real entity, which in fact you are, except it's internal rather than external.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm hearing with the warrior so far, we've got taking action in the world, boundaries, service to the king.
And that sense of existence as well.
Sense of existence. So, I mean, some of the other questions that I had asked was, I mean, we've started to go into this about what makes a balanced and mature warrior. We've kind of, I feel, started to go into that.
I think we have, haven't we? But we can sort of go into it a bit more. So, yes, you're absolutely right. And to do that, Piers, let's just look at the energy of the warrior archetype. So we talked a moment ago about getting things done. So clearly it's about taking action, which is just an expression of male or female energy in the world, as opposed to being passive and sitting back, slack-jawed, watching Netflix all day, although that can be appropriate when the warrior's got downtime. I'm not knocking that, by the way. It's just an observation that when it takes the place of necessary action, that's not so good for people. So beyond action in the world is assertiveness. Okay, that's not acceptable to me. Stop it right now. That kind of assertiveness. You said you would do this by 2 o'clock today and you haven't done it. What's the reason for that? Go and do it now. That kind of assertiveness is the expression of that warrior energy in a direct getting things done form. Beyond that, it's anger, which is typically what happens when people feel their boundaries are being crossed. And that's the 98.8% of the chimp in us. Somebody steps right into your face. There's a surge of anger naturally. It's a genetically programmed protective response. And the reason for it is that that anger energizes you for what might happen next, which of course is probably genetically in history an attack. You're getting in somebody's face, it's generally a threatening thing. Somebody's getting in your face. Anger, ready to defend, protect the boundaries. Now, beyond that, we're beginning to touch on the unbalanced, I should say, warrior, because beyond that, it becomes aggression. So the story I've told quite a lot, because it still seems very relevant to this, is when I was in traffic, I stopped the cars back from the traffic lights, 4 or 5 cars back, and at the front was a van. The door opened, the driver got out, he walked back 2 cars, pulled open the driver's door and just started punching the guy in the driver's seat for no obvious reason. I mean, obviously something had happened. And then people began to pile out their cars and pull him off. But that kind of uncontrolled rage is the warrior that's not balanced. It's out of control. It's inflated, if you like. And why does that happen? Because there internally is no control over what's appropriate expression, or the control has been lost. And then beyond aggression, of course, it becomes rage, which can turn into the killing spree or the self-harming or the suicide. So that gradation of energy is about balance. So what's the characteristic of a balanced and mature warrior? The ability to express it appropriately, to control the level of expression, not to lose control, to know when it's appropriate to be angry, when it's appropriate to be assertive, when it's appropriate to sit back. Yeah. And, you know, although that sounds simple, it isn't. I have a friend who is into mountain biking, and, you know, he's very gung-ho about it. And I did say to him, I wonder if it's your teenager who had a terrible experience in life and has kind of got a bit of a rage against the world. I wonder if it's your teenager who's actually driving, controlling your experience on the mountain. No, I'm fully in control. Anyway, fast forward a few weeks back, he hit a rock. Suffice it to say, spent 9 weeks in hospital and had 5 operations and very nearly died. So when he and I met, I said, who was in charge? He said, yeah, you were right. It was that raging teenager inside me who was in charge. And just where was my control? Lost in the moment where that energy of the teenagers inside him swept through him and took over, which of course is what happens when people open their doors and start punching people in traffic queues or anything else like that, putting your finger, rather your fist through the wall, or smashing the furniture, or throwing plates. Somehow that energy is swept through you and it's taken over. And it's kind of inappropriate, to say the least. So, lack of control, yeah. So if we frame that in a slightly different way, so the balanced and mature warrior is one where there's control, there's an appropriate response, and there's an awareness of what's going on. There's no red mist, there's no loss of control. And also the balanced and mature warrior is using his energy for a purpose which is both, I would say, people can have their own words for this, honorable and in integrity. And it's in service of something greater. And then a third one, a little bit less clear, the warrior's characteristic of acceptance of what is, and if it's not good enough, doing something to improve it next time. So there's this search for improvement and self-advancement, balanced and mature warrior. Hopefully that all makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I've noticed in myself, I kind of have an edge sometimes around that self-improvement. And I've often found, is there something you found really helps people? I mean, going to the Mankind Project where we met, you know, I noticed having other men there or other women to go, hey, it's like, me? What?
I completely agree with you. I always felt when in my own weekend and when I staffed the MKP weekends that there was something about the leveling effect of that big circle, that men who arrived at kind of somewhere up here would descend to a calmer level, and men who arrived depressed would come up to a more normal level of energy. So definitely something about the company you keep, for sure. I mean, you're right. But of course, the other aspect of it is the reason that energy is flying out of control is because it's coming from shadow. So working on your shadows is also essential for control of not just warrior energy, naturally, but everything else. So for those who don't know what shadow is, it's basically what happens when energy can't be expressed. Robert Bly described it as a big bag over the shoulder, trailing behind you, and you have to keep the neck tied to stop the energy in the bag getting out. So, quick example. Got a friend who was Catholic and who was brought up when in a house where the reaction to any anger was, don't bring your anger in here. If you want to be angry, get out of this house. But it wasn't just said, it was demonstrated, ironically enough, with a slap to the head. So a real incentive, real incentive for the child to suppress anger. But as we've already seen, when somebody's in your face, crossing your boundary, or indeed when you don't get what you want, anger can be a quite natural response. So what's the child to do? Get out of this house if you want to be angry. It's not welcome here, slap. Shoves it in the shadow bag. What does that mean? Represses it into the unconscious. But the metaphor's a nice one. So Robert Bly, bless him, pioneer of men's work, pioneer of writing in an accessible way about all of this stuff, said, what goes into the bag doesn't stay the same. It de-evolves towards barbarism. And so when you take it out and look at it, it isn't the same as when it went in. You put it in as childhood anger, teenage anger, perhaps anger throughout your life. And when you take it out, it pops out as a fist in the face of the man in the car behind, a slap to the head of your own children, self-harming, shouting at your wife, smashing the furniture, and so on. So that's the shadow. And the problem with the shadow is, as it de-evolves, it gains more energy. So it has the power, if your attention slackens for a minute, you let go of the ropes around the neck of the bag, out it comes and hits somebody in the face, metaphorically or literally.
Interesting. So it's almost like when we're tired, we're feeling sick, or we're not, we're looking the other way.
Yeah.
That's when
the danger strikes.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Yes. Thank you. That's fascinating.
So, shall we go on talking about the shadows for a moment?
Please do. Yeah. That was the next question. So
yes, you asked about the shadows of the sadist and the masochist. And I think that's an interesting way of putting it, because when energy goes into the bag, it can either inflate or deflate. Not sure why, but it can go one of two ways. It's not consistent. It can switch between the two. Inflation you can think of as the punch in the face. Deflation you can think of as either the punch to the wall. Generally, people will hit objects if they're deflated. If their warrior in the shadows deflated, they won't hit people. If their energy in the bag is inflated, they'll tend to hit people. Or in the deflated case, it can be turned against the self and really depress people. I've had people who've said to me, I've been depressed for 23 years. And, you know, I strongly suspect that that is not a clinical condition. That's energy turned against themselves at such a deep and hidden level that they can't even get in touch with the wound that caused that to happen. But in terms of the sadist and masochist, I think it's when that repressed energy is turned against the self in its inflated form. You're fucking useless. You can't do this. You can't do anything, can you? And so what it tends to do is drive people into frantic activity in an attempt to gain some sense of agency, power, influence, control, achievement, all the things that warriors naturally ought to have. You know, I can get something done if I work till 9 o'clock every night and start at 6 in the morning, 7 days a week. I can get this done. And there may be some satisfaction for somebody in there, but the self-harm is considerable, and the harm to the people around that kind of warrior is considerable. Hence the term sadistic is the way I see it. And as for the masochist, it's like, oh my God, I just can't do anything. Doesn't matter how much I try. Nothing works. Victim, complete victim. And again, that's not a critical judgment. It's just a statement of the way it is, because people in either of those positions are not choosing consciously to be in those positions. They're there because life taught them to be in those positions. They're there because in childhood, they learnt something about themselves from the people around them that made them conclude that was just the way it is for you. Great question, really, when looking at people's shadows is, so what is it that you believe about yourself? What is it that you believe about yourself that makes you behave in that way? That usually digs out a fairly relevant answer. I can't, it doesn't matter what I do. I just don't think I can have any influence on the world. Or the only way to get things done around here is just to work harder and faster and longer and stronger. And then you get into people's beliefs that are causing them to behave in a certain way.
Thank you. Would you say, with the sadist and masochist, as you're speaking there about the inflation, deflation, when we're deflated, is it that, you know, you mentioned about the victim, something to do with power, that I have no power, and we almost project that onto, say, government, onto other people? It's like, I can't do anything.
Exactly, absolutely. I'd have to see, I don't want to be controversial because we're not a political podcast, but it can seem puzzling how people like Donald Trump can gain power in a democratic society, at least. And I think the answer to that is that people project their own, in this case, qualities of kingship or leadership onto somebody who in some way represents that for them and just give up. So they become enslaved to this cycle of projection of their own energy onto some figure out there who can carry it for them. It's a big burden for anybody to carry, of course.
Yeah, of course.
You need to be a slightly or massively grandiose character to be able to support the weight of 50 million Americans' projections, or 100 million, whatever the number was.
Yeah, and I've often seen this over the years when people have taken those projections, like famous band. I used to be into grunge as a teenage boy. That was my way of channeling. It was jumping around a mosh pit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so many of my bands, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, a lot of the lead singers have killed themselves. So it's almost like they couldn't take the projections.
Yeah.
They couldn't hold that weight.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And yeah, wow. Thank you. That's fascinating.
Yeah. It really is, isn't it? The psychology of it, the more we dig into it, the more that becomes clear. I mean, it's an endlessly rich topic. And I hope as we go along that people who are listening to this can see aspects of themselves in what we're talking about and kind of gain a little bit more understanding of how things work. And of course, this isn't like a blueprint for everybody. This is just the way it can work. It can be different in different people. It's all about what you learn in childhood, where your emotional wounds come from, how they're inflicted, how they impact you, whether they stay with you, or what work you do to get over them, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that how to link this in, because a lot of my audience are ex-boarders, had childhood trauma. And I was thinking, why this is so important, these conversations with you, is because as boys or girls, we don't learn what it is to be a mature man.
That's right.
If you're at home, not always, but you watch your parents, friends, or you watch your friends' parents, you have these adults around you. Boarding school, you don't have that.
Absolutely. And indeed, in addition to that, I'd venture, Piers, that even when you go home, there's a sense of separation and perhaps betrayal, which prevents that bonding, that kind of emulation. So yes, you're completely correct. For a child in a perfect environment, if such a thing ever existed on the face of this planet, it's in the air that they breathe. That's just how things are. They soak it up and it becomes their way of being. But as soon as the damage starts being inflicted, then everything can go wrong and the patterns are not imprinted correctly. Sadist and masochist being two prime examples of that. Work hard, work hard, work hard. Kill yourself working hard. Abandon your family, one of the warrior's other jobs. Just get this job done. Build this business. See a lot of men in their late 30s who are really in crisis because they've spent 10 or 15 years building a business, spending 12, 14 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week building a business, and they've achieved massive financial success because of their warrior. But inside them, there's no king saying, whoa, what's going on here? You need some help, man. Just slow down, step back, relax. What's going on with your family? What's going on with your children? It's like the warrior's taken complete control of them. It's quite dysfunctional. It's very dysfunctional, actually.
Yeah. Fascinating. So I'd love you to go in now into some of the steps. What are some of the steps that we can take to start to embody this warrior?
It's a great question. And there are some great books out there which are very instructive on it. This one by Josh Waitkin, I'd highly recommend.
Okay, I've not heard of
Josh Waitkin, The Art of Learning. Perhaps you could put this out in some way as a resource.
Yeah. I'll put that into the notes of the description.
Fantastic. Well, Josh is an interesting character. He started off as a child playing chess and became a grandmaster at quite an early age, actually, 23, I think, if I remember rightly. Phenomenal achievement. And he gave it up essentially, I think, if I'm reading the story correctly, because it wasn't the world in which there was a great deal of honor. For instance, he recounts a tournament with Russians where they were using some really underhand tricks to distract their opponents. kicking the table, for instance, and, you know, a kind of sleazy environment where winning was all that mattered. But having made his position as Grand Master, he then decided to train as a martial arts exponent of push hands Tai Chi, which is actually one of the, I believe, one of the more physical, shall we say, martial arts, very violent, actually. It's Taiwanese, I think. And he became world champion at that. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because in his description of how clearly he moved from magician to warrior, magician being the chess and the analytics and the thinking, to Tai Chi, push hands Tai Chi, which is very much warrior. His description of how he did that, or the analysis of how he did that, is fascinating. He talks about the neural pathways being rebuilt, the minute level of analysis of what needed to be done so that every step of the process could be worked on till it was perfect. And in more particularly, more generally, the practice that goes into it. Endless practice every day of his life. And as I was reading that, I was thinking of, yeah, that's so true, isn't it? Warrior jobs, fire people, firefighters, police people, army men and women, sportsmen and women, they all have to practice pretty relentlessly to get that level of skill and perfection where everything is just an instant reaction. You know, you couldn't possibly, I imagine, I've never tried to do it, but I imagine you couldn't consciously spot a tennis ball flying at you at whatever speed they come, or a cricket ball coming at you at 100 miles an hour. You have to just react instinctively. So repetition and practice of the steps involved is one real warrior discipline. And you might say, yeah, but you're talking about setting boundaries with people, and you're talking about doing a job and going out in the world and getting things done. It's not exactly like any of those. Except in a way, I think it is, because what's assertiveness training if not practicing the steps of being assertive? Mm-hmm. And, you know, if we break that down to, say, physical fitness, which is a very good warrior quality, then what's that about? It's about breaking down the steps of an exercise regime so that you can practice it every day in a way that's effective. So there's definitely something about training and practice to cultivate a warrior, for sure, absolutely. Mm. And even, you know, even the art of leadership. And so one of the questions that somebody sent in was, how do you train and motivate others to become a good leader? Well, the answer is you take the steps yourself that make you a good leader, and then you model it to other people. So you mentioned earlier on that Marianne and I have started a training course so that people who may not have any experience of counseling or therapy can become effective practitioners, not just in terms of technique, but in terms of relationship with their clients. So that's my step up. If you think of this kind of gradual series of learnings and doing things that are more challenging. So I started off many years ago on a counseling course, then I took a psychotherapy training, then I took the shadow work training, then I started working with clients one-to-one, started in groups, went to one-to-one, etc., etc. Every step incrementally increasing my warrior's ability to get things done in a satisfactory way. And then the natural next step was, well, let's do a training course so that other people can step up bit by bit to become practitioners. So the essence of it is just extending your challenges bit by bit, gradually, incrementally, at a pace that's right for you, but not giving up, setting challenges that you can overcome. So a client of mine was saying, I've got to make a speech. I've got to make an after-dinner speech at a wedding. It's awful. I'm the best man. What am I going to do? It's in December and time is so short. So, well, what do you think you could do? I don't know what I could do. That's why I'm asking you. Okay. So it's kind of interesting orientation there. Okay, well, what I suggest is you go and get some training. Find somebody who can teach you to make a speech in public. So guess what? His warrior gets him out there, goes to the course, he comes back. It was amazing. I can make a speech now. So training and practice. That's the incremental skill. Bit by bit, you do something more challenging. But there is a twist, as always, and that's the question of resilience. Because people who are not resilient, who can't bounce back from setbacks or defeat, tend to experience a deflation of warrior. So how do you learn resilience? Well, I don't know the answer to that, actually, Piers. I mean, what do you think? I mean, you've been to boarding school. How did I assume there was some resilience in you somewhere.
Yeah. So how do I? It's interesting. I've just come across. I've heard it the last year. This thing of anti-fragile. Have you heard that? That's a new
No, I
thing.
haven't. No, that's really amazing. What's that?
Well, it's like, resilience is something we build up that we can be resilient, but then we need to rest. Anti-fragile, they're saying, is the step where something comes to us and it makes us stronger.
Right.
Okay. So it's like, rather than it depleting us. So for me, I don't quite understand. I'm just getting my head around it. But the idea of resilience for me is, I guess it's almost like training my nervous system. Yeah. So it's like with my wife, before, I would be in conflict, it would just be so painful, and I'd do one of the 4 things of run away, try and fix her, get angry. And what I've learned to do is do the 5th thing, which is more like be present and retrain my neural system to just sit there and maybe cry.
Yeah,
so absolutely. I become more resilient.
Exactly. Now you've really hit on something absolutely important: training the nervous system. So in essence, everything that you just described, those 4 reactions, are the product of childhood trauma, because a healthy nervous system doesn't react in that way. That what people call triggering, usually I notice expressed as you triggered me.
Yeah.
No, I just said something. Yes, but you triggered me, i.e. it's your fault. That reaction is not natural. It comes from what people experience in childhood, their emotional wounding. Like, for example, to go back to the anger, don't bring your anger in here, slap. So partner 30 years later gets angry with the man. What does he do? He regresses into his internal child and the memories of what it felt like when he got slapped around the head by his father for being angry. Or worse, how he felt when other people were angry, which is probably quite fearful. So in the light of that, how does he get out of that place? Well, there's 2 main ways. One is crying and one is being angry as an adult, but actually not from the adult part of yourself, although people might not see it or experience it this way, from the childlike part of themselves that suffered those emotional wounds. That's what builds resilience in the adult, that the child inside them, its energetic distress shrinks. Every time they cry, every time the child in me cried, it's cried buckets over the years. Thought it would never stop, actually. It takes quite a while. That reservoir of reactivity shrinks because the trauma disappears. Every time the adult gets angry and expresses anger against the perpetrators in childhood, which is really the child inside the adult getting angry and expressing the rage that he feels about those perpetrators, that trauma shrinks. So there becomes a clearer, cleaner ability to react to what's going on in the world around you as an adult. So this is where shadow work, emotional process work, counseling that's got some kind of action in it, not just talking therapy, useful though that can be, this is where healing really begins. That somehow you find a way to lead people into the anger they weren't able to express as a child, or the grief they weren't able to express as a child, or the joy they weren't able to express as a child, or indeed into an awareness of their intellectual capacity that was suppressed in them as a child. And every time you take them into that place in some kind of action-based process work, their ability to be more whole and more adult in the world now increases just a little bit. And it's not a fast process, I allow that, but it does work. And in a way, I was going to say it's the only thing that works, but that's too strong a statement. I can't make that statement. Let me put it this way. It's worked for me and it's worked for many of the clients I've worked with over the years, that the expression of grief, the expression of anger, and the other repressed emotions in an appropriate setting that's safe, and in an appropriate setting that allows it to be directed to the source way back when, is the healing energy that people need to, amongst other things, increase the strength of their warrior, increase the resilience of their warrior, increase the warrior's capacity to be confident and go out into the world.
Thank you. And I, over the last couple of years since we last spoken, I've read through quite a few different books about trauma. Judith Herman, a psychiatrist, said the 3 stages of feeling safe. Second stage is grieving and mourning. She says we have to go through that. And then we come out the other side. And Robert Moore talks about the 3 stages in the initiation arc. And again, the middle process is that delving deep into the, how would you say, the, I was going to say subliminal, but more the profane, the sacred space within. Yeah. And again, he's saying that importance to break down. So yeah, I totally feel that. That's so important for us to grieve.
Yeah, definitely. And the challenge, particularly around grieving, is that people fear that it's too painful. I've heard so many people over the years say, I can't do it. It's going to be too painful. The reality is a little bit different. It's the grieving that brings about the relief of the pain, and it feels, I will admit from my own experience, that you're like in an ocean of grief to start with, that it's never going to, but eventually, you know what, I can remember one specific workshop I was on where I was doing some grief work, and suddenly it felt almost like my head had come out of the water. Thank God, I thought I can breathe at last. And there's a point, of course, it doesn't have to be work that goes on for the entire lifespan of an individual, would be ridiculous. It's the point where your head's out of the water and you can breathe, or where your anger is controllable and it's not going to burst out of the shadow bag unexpectedly. That's when you can relax and look around you and think, fuck, at last I'm in control of my own life.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So I realize we've got about 10 minutes left. Is there any other things of cultivating the warrior you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think it's important for men in particular. I can't speak of the visceral experience of women around being in a same-sex group, but I assume it may be similar. But I know for a fact that for men, it's really important to find a company of men. You referred to that indirectly a while back, Piers, in the MKP big circle, the way men change just by being in that circle. So my advice would be find a men's group, or if you haven't got one, start one. So there's a book which we can put in the resources that might help men to start a men's group. And find a code of values. Find out what's important. Live by a code of values which must include integrity and authenticity. And by authenticity, let's summarize that by saying, speak your truth without fear or favor. That's easier said than done. Yeah. And integrity, I do what I say I will do. I am who I pretend to be. I am who I say I am. I do what I say I will do. My actions match my words. Yeah. So one thing I'd just like to talk about briefly before we have a look at those questions was the boyhood form of the archetype, the hero. I think it's basically an immature warrior, Piers. It's like, the rationale Moore and Gillette put forward in their book was that the boy is subject to this flood of testosterone. He doesn't know what to do with it. And it completely changes his world. So he needs the expression of that flood of testosterone is grandiosity. I can do anything. Look at me, I'm a hero. And that reminds me of the story I told you about the teenage boy inside my client on the mountain bike. I can do anything. Look at this. I'm going to take the strongest, fastest, hardest, most challenging route. Bang, I'm in hospital having 5 operations. Not good. And I think there is an element of that. Although actually the truth is, you could call that the grandstanding hero. The opposite side of it, which I think these days probably applies to more teenagers, is total fucking depression. They're just miserable. And instead of being an inflated hero in the world, their teenage experience of the warrior is just that internal beating down. Oh God. and a kind of shrinking. So that would be what Moore and Gillette, I believe, would be what Moore and Gillette called the opposite side of that was the coward, wasn't it?
Yeah.
An unpleasant word.
Yeah.
Because what boys of that age need is support from mature men. So if I may, I'd just like to talk about initiation rituals. Moore and Gillette were quite clear that they believed that initiation rituals, boys in their teens in tribal societies, were about separation from the feminine and joining the world of men by a challenge. And I'm not sure I believe that that's what it was about. I think there are, at the very least, other possible explanations. The first one is something perverse about human nature, which Alice Miller was really the first 20th century psychotherapist to expose, which was child abuse was systematic in our society and actually always has been. For some reason, I don't quite know why, chimps don't abuse their infants. But anyway, as humans, we seem to inflict wounds on children unconsciously all the time. So I did wonder, and still do, if initiation rituals were just a ritualized form of child abuse. Now, I know that's a very potentially controversial statement, so I'm just going to put that on the shelf and leave it there. More likely, in my mind, is the idea that if you correlate the level of pain and, frankly, what I would describe as torture in an initiation ritual for boys, you will find that's greater the more warlike the society was, with one or two exceptions, almost in a straight line correlation. The more warlike the society, the harsher the initiation rituals. And that leads me to wonder if what the initiation rituals were really about was actually separating the boy from his feelings so that he could go into battle without fear, just not feeling anything, because that's what happens to people who are massively traumatized. In that way, they stop feeling because it's just they cut themselves off from it. So I don't know whether that's true or not, but I think it's certainly a plausible possibility. And on that front, I'm remembering Nelson Mandela's description in his autobiography of his excitement and how essential it was to their self-identity to have the ritual of circumcision, and how he looked forward to it, and how it was done by the tribal elder, I suppose, pulling the foreskin forward and then with the cleaver, chopping it off with no anesthetic. And the test of the boy was that he was biting down on a piece of wood, I believe. And if he cried, it was a failure. He was regarded differently if he cried. The object of the exercise for the boy was not to cry. And I think of the extreme level of pain and suffering that something like that inflicts. I can't see that in a frame of anything other than child abuse or making a boy so hard that he can go into battle without feeling, or at least his level of feeling is substantially reduced. I don't know. This is just speculation. On the other side of the argument stands things like the MKP, which is, the MKP weekend is a pseudo ritual initiation.
So it's the Mankind Project.
Mankind Project, yes. And in other forms too, Illumin, that's a Catholic charity that does initiation weekends for men. The truth is, those weekends, they're not inflicting any pain or suffering on people, certainly not in the way those initiation rituals were designed to do. Men do emerge from those weekends changed. They have a greater sense of their own masculinity, their own maturity. So it's like there is something about that process which changes people internally. So I don't know where the truth lies between those two extremes of the Mankind Project. Modern day, we're not going to do you any physical harm weekend, and the initiation rituals where we definitely are going to do you physical harm and you'll live in fear before it and after it, pain after it. I don't know where the truth lies, but I do know that there's some value in the Mankind Project and similar activities, because that does seem to switch men's masculinity on in a way that nothing else does. So a case of go figure, really. And I've heard some wonderful stories. One man, after he'd been on the Mankind Project weekend, told me he was going home on the train. And he said to the ticket collector, what time's my change at Manchester, and what do you know which platform I go to? And the man says, oh, just get off the train and somebody there will tell you. And without thinking about it, the words came out of his mouth were something like, hey man, do your job. Go and find out for me what time the trains are and what platform I need. And the interesting thing is, although that sounds quite aggressive, it's not delivered in an aggressive way. It's delivered in a very clean way. That's the real assertiveness of the warrior. And the ticket collector just looked at him, turned around, went away, got the information, came back and gave it to him. And I've heard many similar stories. It's like the true impact of the warrior on the world when it's delivered cleanly. So, go figure again what's going on there.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, because I think we really are frightened, and you mentioned that a bit in the beginning of the book about the warrior, that the word kind of frightens people.
Indeed,
and I feel that energy frightens, and yet it can be really clean, because it's like, no, I've had enough.
Yeah.
What you're doing in this world with the environment, whatever, enough.
Yeah.
Clean. It doesn't have to be angry or aggressive, but it's just, and I think, I see we really need that energy.
We certainly do. And one of the questions that you offered me before we started was, who are my heroes? Which kind of took a little bit of thinking about. But I came up with Boudica, which is very interesting, because anybody who is interested can read how she fought with such ferocity and such absolute focus for the Britons against the invading Romans, slaughtered them, in fact. At no cost to herself. The Romans, I think, had raped and maybe killed 2 of her 3 daughters, which was what inspired her to take action against them. And she was an extraordinary woman who, in many ways, just epitomized the warrior energy, really. It's just quite extraordinary. But the other answer I have to the question is the men and women who sit down in the road, even though that's now illegal. The men and women who stand outside Parliament chanting and shouting, and on Vauxhall Bridge and Westminster Bridge chanting and shouting, even though that's now illegal. So as the forces of something bigger than they seek to repress them with legislation, a noisy demonstration is illegal in this country, I believe now. They still do it. So there's warrior energy, fighting for a cause, hopefully with integrity and with some higher value in mind. And getting arrested. I have a friend who's been arrested 19 times on protests, and he laughs about it.
I think I probably know that man.
It's not you, is it, Piers?
It's not me.
No. Oh, gosh, yeah. Oh, so I think there's a final question, isn't there, which is about what happens when the warrior feels or is defeated?
Yeah.
So the answer is, unless the warrior's got enough resilience, he'll collapse. Which takes us right back to the point about developing resilience, and that sort of incremental increase in challenging yourself with slightly more difficult things day by day, and not giving up as a choice, but also doing the work on the historical trauma that allows that energy to flow out more freely and more powerfully in the world.
Fascinating. Yeah. I feel that's what I'm really getting from hearing you speak, the importance of, that daily practice or that daily what's needed today, that warrior.
That really keeps the tools sharp. Yeah.
And also, because that was question 6, was how to keep the warrior's abilities, weapons in the best shape for when they're needed.
Yeah.
Right.
Practice
Get up, practice, do your martial arts, your push hands in the morning or whatever.
Yeah. Don't let the offhand people, sorry, let me start again. I was in a shop the other day and I bought something, took it to the counter, and the girl behind the counter didn't once look at me and continued talking to 2 of her colleagues all the way through the transaction I was having with her. And I just let it slide. And you might say, well, it doesn't matter. But that's not the point. In terms of keeping the warrior's skills sharp, there's something to be done around that. I don't quite know what it is on the spur of the moment, but it's something about, hey, this isn't acceptable. Not saying that, of course, in that particular situation, but expressing that energy in some way. I would actually like an interaction with you while you're serving me. So how is my warrior going to make that happen? I don't know. I'd have to think about it, which is probably why I let it slide. But it's only a silly illustration of every time you let something slide where your warrior could step in, you're not necessarily helping yourself to be more warrior-like in the world.
It's interesting. I had the same thing yesterday.
Did you?
But I went into a shop and I walked in and the lady didn't say anything. And she just stood there and I said, "Oh, good morning." And she's like, "Oh, morning."
Yeah, exactly.
And it was like, yeah, not talking, but it made me reflect, oh, that was a bit weird.
And of course, as I say that, I think, well, of course, it's not the kind of thing we're trained in any way by anybody, is it? Unless we see it being done by example by our parents or other people around us. It's like, "Oh, hi, I'm just wondering if you're having a hard day. You don't seem inclined to talk to me today," with a smile on the face. It's actually really quite warrior underneath. Might look like a friendly overture, but the message is clear. I would like you to just look at me and talk to me while we're having this interaction, that kind of thing. So again, not a great example, but perhaps it serves to make the point. Just to repeat, every time you let something slide that your warrior could intervene in, you're not keeping your tools sharp. You're letting them go rustier. Bit by bit, I would suggest.
Yeah, and would you recommend, you mentioned this before, I believe this idea maybe once a week or once a month to actually do an internal recce going, right, have I been letting things slide? How am I doing?
I'd recommend it on a daily basis, actually, Piers, to be honest. Okay. Next time, because I think we're running a little bit over at the moment, but there's an exercise people can do very simply of stepping into an image of their archetypes, which we practiced, I think, online the first time you and I spoke, if I recall correctly. Yeah. But, you can do that for every archetype just to actually embody that energy more fully. So we'll go through that in detail next time on the next podcast, because it's an amazing exercise. It's so simple. And it can allow people to really feel into that energy and just check what's going on there. Amazing. And that demonstrates to me, in conclusion, just how near these things are to the surface all the time. They really are. It's not like there's some deep kind of archetypal thing buried in the unconscious. They're really part of who we are.
Thank you. Yes, so just to kind of say that our intention with Rod is to continue the conversation to talk about the magician, the lover, and the king over the coming months. So that's the plan. So thank you for agreeing to speak to me again.
It's a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. And it's really even more of a pleasure to reach out beyond you to all the men and women who might be listening to the podcast as well.
Yeah, well, I've had quite a few people said, "Oh, can you interview Rod again?" I'm like, sure. Yes, I feel most honored. So the last question is, how do people connect to your work? You mentioned about doing the Healing the Shadow. When's the next practitioner?
The next practitioner training, which is such a fantastic opportunity to engage in personal development work between the start and the finish of that course as well, obviously. The more you've dealt with your own stuff, the more effective a practitioner you'll be. And without sounding pious, it's just a simple statement of my truth. My life has really, in many ways, only had deep, serious meaning since I started working with clients and delving into with them, taking that journey into their unconscious and the woundings. I suppose if I put that more simply, if I look back, I would never have chosen any other career. So it's beautiful to be able to offer the training to other people. And we have 2 places left and it starts in January. So if I could give you some websites, you could put that out perhaps with the...
I'll put them in the description along with the Art of Learning and the resources for starting men's circles and also your book as well. I'll put that.
Fantastic. That would be great. And I think there's another book that I wanted to add in there as well. Yes. Complex PTSD by Pete Walker.
Oh, yeah.
It's the best explanation of why people are the way they are that I've seen for quite some time.
I reached out to him to come onto the podcast. He said he's really busy. He'd love to come on, but maybe in the future. But yeah, that's a brilliant book. So
yeah. Well, that's great. I wish he had said yes.
yeah,
Anyway,
well, I think he wants to, but he's just too busy. So
Warrior's drawing the boundary.
yeah,
I know I can do it. I want to do it. No, you haven't got time, Pete. Don't do it. Warrior steps in, sets the boundary.
Yeah,
Good for him. Good for his warrior.
Cool. Well, I'm going to draw this to an end now. Maybe if we just do a little checkout once I press stop. But thank you so much. Really beautiful wisdom, and yeah, please do, people, go and get a copy of Rod's book. It's brilliant. Really good for men and women.
Thank you very much.
Look at his website as well. Okay. Well, thank you, Rod.
It's an absolute pleasure.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Cheers for now.